Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Dev Influencers Podcast. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the next chapter in my story. And essentially, this is the part where I went out on my own. Okay, so I think I left off where I got laid off, went and got a job 6 hours later. When I went and worked at that job, I became the team lead, even though I only had like 1 year's worth of real programming experience. And it's funny because it surprises people that it's like you only had a year's worth of experience and you were the team lead, and the answer is yeah, but there's a little more to it than that. And essentially what it boils down to is one, I had more Rails experience than anybody else on the team, which is kind of funny. The other thing is everybody else had been hired more or less around the same time I had. I mean, one guy on my team had been at that company for years and years and years and years, and then Justin, and then everybody else had basically been hired not too much before me. And so as people kind of came into the team and things like that, they made me the team lead. The other thing that was going on though at the time was that I did have the podcasts and the screencasts going my way, right? So they were pulling weight for me and demonstrating that I had technical skills, right? And so it worked out really, really well, and I wound up becoming the team lead. Now my boss at the time was kind of a pain in the neck, right? And he would come in and he would cowboy code some stuff up and like break half the system, and then we'd have to go clean it up and finish implementing whatever it was that he told us that he wanted in there, right? And the CEO was also kind of a problematic person in the sense that he let his ego get in the way of a lot of progression for the team. I remember at one point, actually, I shouldn't complain about these people, but I'm gonna throw out one story just to kind of illustrate where things were, and then I kind of moved on from that company. So my boss Jared came in and he looked at me and he basically said, somebody on this team is getting fired. And he said it in front of my whole team, right? It was basically, we're going to watch you guys over the next 2 weeks, and whoever doesn't pull their weight is going to get fired. And there were 4 of us, right? 5 of us if you included Justin. And as soon as he did that, and, I wasn't a seasoned manager. I'd never managed anybody in my life, really. I'm the oldest of 10 kids, so I managed my siblings, I guess, sometimes. But I just took him aside and I said, you can't do that, right? And he's like, well, why not? And I said, look, if you're trying to pit us against each other, it's not going to work. And he's like, well, it's only about those 2 guys, and I'm not going to say their names. One of them I'm still in touch with, and I don't know if he realized it or not that he was one of the 2 people on the chopping block, but anyway, so my boss basically said, well, we're going to get to work. And, he was trying to motivate us, and he did it in the dumbest way possible. So anyway, I said, well, look, I'm not going to pick who gets fired. And, I'm going to go to bat for whoever you decide to fire. And so anyway, we went through the whole process. And, by the way, this is very indicative of the way things went. There were internal politics out the wazoo. And what's funny is it was this tiny company, right? So Justin had been there forever. He wound up on my team. He was sort of reporting to me, and I was sort of reporting to him. And we were both sort of reporting to Jared, but Jared also sort of reported to him. And, if you were part of the in crowd with the CEO, then you got to go to all the special lunches and breakfasts and, you got anyway. So he basically, had his entourage was the way it worked. And then the rest of us just worked for the company. And it was a fascinating project and things like that. The other thing that went on was that there were a couple of us that decided that we were going to, in our spare time, launch a company that did kind of a different kind of lead gen and, had these certain aspects to it. It was one of the designers, 2 of the developers, and myself. And so we were going to pull this thing together. He caught wind of it. The CEO actually dragged us into his office, asked us to explain what we were doing, and we were smart enough to do it. We should have just told him to stick it. But we told him what we were doing, and he said, well, do you realize that you all signed a non-compete? I should tell you what, because the non I was not worried about the non compete. He's like, you all signed a non compete with this company, and we had a branch of the company that did exactly what you were talking about, that closed up 2 years ago, but we still own the brand, and the brand still sponsors this sports team somewhere. I can't even remember which sports team it was, but it was, Utah sports team, I think. And so, if you start this company, you're in violation of your non-compete and I will sue you, which wasn't worth it. So we didn't, right? But, rather than encourage us, right? Or, get us to relaunch his brand and, give us some kind of equity deal, because I think we all would have stayed around forever if he'd done that. He basically came in and swung his ego around and knocked us all down, and then basically told us to quit crying about it. So, anyway, this was not the ideal place to work. The reason I wasn't worried about the non-compete was that I had experienced something with somebody else, and basically had an attorney explain to me that if I crossed out anything in my contract that I didn't want to agree to, and then initialed it and dated it, then, on the original document, right, when I signed it, that would be all that was binding, was everything that wasn't crossed out. And so I had actually crossed out the non-competitive language in my contract, and the attorney and the CEO hadn't caught it, right? They just took the stack of papers and filed it, right? He countersigned it and they filed it, and I got my copy of it. And so at the end of the day, I didn't have a binding non-compete. And there's some debate too, because Utah's a right to work state, as to how far they can push a non-compete, right? But anyway, so I had signed this non-compete, and he used that to bludgeon people. And so I'd been there for like 9 months and started applying to jobs. But by this time, I'd been going to the users groups. By the way, if you're trying to level up, go to the users groups, because you'll meet a ton of people that can help you along in your career. And then between the podcast and the screencast, I mean, people knew who I was, right? And we had actually hosted a couple of meetups at the office that I worked in. There were some other, things that we had, pulled together and put together. And, I was kind of in the orbit of some of the people running conferences in Utah. And, so it all kind of came together, in that way. And so I knew that if I wanted to leave, I could leave. And him kiboshing that business was the final straw. And at the same time, I was listening to all these business podcasts where they were actually talking about how to start a business and how to go out on your own and all this stuff. And the other thing I realized was that my son, my oldest, who is now much older than 4, he was getting ready to go to kindergarten. And, that next year. And I wanted to be able to go to all of his kindergarten stuff, right? I didn't want to be that dad that was like, well, I'm at work, tape the thing. I wanted to be at all the things, right? And so I realized that the only way I could guarantee that was if I was independent, if I went out on my own as a freelancer or something else and started a business. And so that was kind of something that I was thinking about anyway. And so when that got nixed, I basically realized that I was just going to, I was done. I was done dealing with the garbage that I was dealing with from the CEO. I was done working for that kind of stuff. And anyway, so I started looking for a job, and I got a job offer from a company that was doing actually the same thing I was doing, right? And they sent me the offer, and I almost accepted it, and I just got this feeling that it wasn't right, And I'm religious. I'd been praying about it, and I really felt like I was being told, no, don't take this job. And it turned out that after a month or so, they laid off like half of their development team, more than half of their development team. And me being the new guy, both in the experience sense and in the we just hired you sense, I mean, I would have been let go too. And so that actually worked out. I held on to that job for another 3 or 4 months. And then my friend David Brady, who you may know from the Ruby Rogues podcast, he was on that for quite a long time. He was also my neighbor at the time. He was working at this other company, and so I asked him where he was working, and I think he was one of the people that got laid off from the other company. So anyway, he let me know that they were hiring, because I was like, hey, where are you working? Well, I'm working over here. They're hiring. And so I put in my resume, went up for the interview, got the interview done, talked to my soon to be boss, and walked out of there, thinking, okay, well, this seems like a cool place to be. And I got the job for the salary I asked for. And it was funny because my boss told me basically when he hired me, you don't have enough experience on your resume to, I almost didn't hire you, but there's enough here that's interesting. And it sounds like you can solve some of these specific issues we have. And so I'm basically taking a chance on you is what he told me. And so I got the job there and we worked there for 6 months. And then, about 2 months after I got hired there, they hired a marketing guy, as the CMO, right? And so he came in and he basically took the company off in a different direction. And we started building all this stuff. So what that company did was they basically provided analytics on crime data for police departments. And then they also had a contract with the police departments so that the crime data could also be published on a map. Okay. And they anonymized the data, right? So you knew kind of which block it was on, but you didn't have the exact address or, anything else, but you knew that like a robbery or some kind of violent crime had happened there, right? You didn't know exactly what the crime was either, right? But it was a theft or this or that. And it had the sex offenders database on there, right? So you knew there was a sex offender in the neighborhood and all of that stuff, right? And so you could go on crimereports.com and check it out. It's not around anymore. So don't try because it's not going to work. But we were working on that stuff. And so I got that job and he kind of took things off in this other direction. And the police departments that were paying the bills for this company had been waiting for them to update their tools. And they didn't want this other tool where we were building like basically a neighborhood watch portal is what we wound up building. And so the police department started pulling their money out. They stopped paying for the services because the services weren't delivering what they wanted anymore. And so after a while, the company started to become non-productive or non-profitable. And when I got hired, they were well into the black, but they were into the red. The board came in, fired the CTO, fired a whole bunch of other people, told them to lay a bunch of us off, so David and I both got laid off and wound up going independent. Now I was still doing the podcast and the screencasts and everything at that point. Right. And so that all worked out, as far as that went. We did wind up doing this. We called it a death march, but it was basically 80-hour weeks for like 3 or 4 weeks. And then this was right before we got laid off to finish the portal that we'd been building. Right. And then they laid us off because, yeah. So we got a bonus for it, though, and we got severance, and I wound up going freelance at that point. What's interesting is that as soon as I went freelance, found out about this opportunity at another company, and so I applied to it. I thought it was a full-time job, and it turned out it was a contract. And I completely underbid everybody else because I didn't know what I was doing. That's a story for another day. But I completely underbid everybody else. I got that contract, and I had also made a deal with my wife. This is also another story. That when the money ran out, that I would go get a full-time job, right? But I wanted to be out on my own. Out on my own. I wanted to prove I could do it. And I wanted to be around for my kids' stuff, right? So, so went out on my own. And that first deal, I got because I completely underbid everybody. I found out about it from the same group of guys that had all there were a bunch of us that had gotten laid off at the same time from different companies. And so we all went to lunch. They were all talking about this opportunity. We all applied, and I got it because I bid less than half what they did on my hourly rate. And then it didn't take too long, though, before the next contract came in, and that came through somebody that I had actually met through the podcasts. And so I've kind of skimmed over a bunch of stuff, and I'll probably go back and kind of fill in some of the details there. But I just kind of wanted to bridge that gap because what wound up happening was I wound up being able to support myself as a freelancer because people knew that I was capable from the podcasts and from the screencasts. And so I'll jump in and I'll talk about, some of those contracts that I got from the podcast next time. And I'll also probably go back and fill in some of the other details as far as like speaking and stuff like that kind of came out of some of this stuff. So anyway, stay tuned for that. But yeah, just kind of filled in some of the details there as time went on. On this episode, I don't know that there's an overarching theme to this one, but yeah. So hang in there, and until next time, Max out.